cannabis prohibition literature, these stories of assassins and degenerates and things like that, is just, the hypocrisy is pretty obvious if for people who spend any time around cannabis. It's important to recognize that the hypocrisy and the racist stories have been perpetuated in pro-cannabis literature as well. And so it's important to recognize that, right? To recognize that a lot of the stories that people know about cannabis reflect the same sort of racial categories and racial ideas and judgments that existed, historically in the anti-cannabis literature, but they've kind of just been taken up as a given in the pro-cannabis literature and kind of perpetuated onward, right? And ignoring the fact that there were a lot of, people, not from Europe and not in positions of power that benefited from cannabis. That challenges racial stereotypes that people don't recognize that they have to begin with. But it also gives a more honest intellectual foundation for, advocating for cannabis nowadays, not building on these stories that, Queen Victoria used cannabis or George Washington or whatever, but saying actual people who were actually marginalized because of racial categories, because of socioeconomic inequalities, those were the people that existed in the past who used cannabis and were discriminated against. And we also need to understand that persists now, and we need to address that and not just kind of come up with these artificial histories that serve these political purposes that don't do anyone any good, right? And so addressing stereotypes is really what I hope to do in addressing my work.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. In the pro-cannabis literature, there's a lot of association of cannabis with people who would help them get their point across that it's a respectable plant. Like, for instance, the Queen Victoria or George Washington. Although I have to disagree, George Washington actually, in his diaries, spoke of having his cannabis tea to relax in the afternoon. So I think he actually was a user. But I think you're right, though. There's a lot of sensationalization that goes on.
We would have to, before I accept it, I'd have to go and look at George Washington's diaries, because a lot of the stuff that's out there, like there's accounts that circulate about, him, harvesting the flowers in order to, roll joints. If you go to his actual diaries, he either doesn't say those things, or if you read it in context, he's talking about something completely different that people with 2010s sort of understanding of the plant go back and look at it and they say, oh, this must have been what happened. But that's done without kind of an understanding of the historical context or what was going on. And, to say anything about Queen Victoria or George Washington is heretical to some audiences, and I totally get that, and I've heard it, but a lot of the stuff that is in the pro-cannabis literature is just, demonstrably false. And so George Washington, for instance, his association with it as a drug, sure, he was a farmer. He planted hemp. Most of the time, people in George Washington's time period in the United States planted hemp to make clothing for slaves because it was cheap and easy to process for low-quality fibers. The stories that he used it as a drug trace, as far as I can tell, to two sources. One was an advocacy poster that was made in 1972, I think, from an organization called Amorpha, which was kind of a precursor to Normal. And they basically took some quotes out of his diary that were taken out of context and inaccurately summarized anyway. And then the second one was a weekly newspaper, like a weekly newspaper, the free things that you can get in many places, that actually traced here to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I am. There was a page of jokes about cannabis and people, and it said, oh, these 7 U.S. presidents used cannabis, and it was, part of this series of jokes that they were laying out. It was taken up into this magazine in the late 1970s, and that was taken up into The Emperor Wears No Clothes and some other books at that time period, and it's been presented as truth, but it traces to a very identifiable point in time. The same thing could be said about Queen Victoria, and there's some other stories there that, that's where my research in cannabis comes from, is that I went to these common sources and said, oh, this is what's going on. But as an academic, I went and looked further, and there's so many things that are just false that circulate about cannabis, whether it's pro-cannabis or anti-cannabis. Most of the things that people read that, ostensibly portray the history are omitting information, they're misrepresenting information, or they're just false, right? And that's a lot of what is in, the books that I've written, is saying, look, let's be a little more honest and a little more real about what this plant's history actually was, because that's a better foundation for figuring out how to manage it more effectively than, the context that's existed under Prohibition, which hasn't helped anyone.
Right. Well, you know what? The sensational exaggerations, if you will, I think they were all born from people desperately trying to convince an unconvincible public that cannabis was okay. And historically, that's got some significance as well. I think, it's just very interesting how it has all evolved. And I think you're right. Because of that, there's just a lot of misinformation that actually backfired. Instead of being a tool to convince people, it was a tool to say, oh, you people are nuts. And, you're wrong about this, so therefore you must be wrong about the entire plant.
Yeah, and that's the key thing that I want to make. The key point, I guess, I want to make is that myth making has its place. It's important for making a political point, and it's important to recognize that a lot of the materials that have been written about cannabis are not histories, they're political advocacies. And so, The Emperor Wears No Clothes, great piece of political advocacy. You can't open that book without being convinced that indeed hemp will save the planet, right? But it's really poorly researched, right? And I don't mean to pick on anyone in particular.
Yeah, well, the fact that some of it was factually incorrect does not diminish the importance of the work, because it did spearhead an entire movement. But not only that, to his credit, like I mentioned before, there's so little written about it that you really had to go digging into deep archives to try to find any information about cannabis. And when you think of where he was in prison for advocating for cannabis when he wrote most of that book. And so he didn't have access to the kind of facts that you would need to feel good about the information that you're putting out. So to his credit, that's an important point to make. But yeah.
I feel bad in a sense, like picking on that book, because it is so effective as a piece of political advocacy. And I can't think of another book that is as effective at presenting and pushing an agenda of legalization, of using hemp and using cannabis more wisely, of putting a plant resource into better use as the end goal. He does it really well. But it's important to recognize that political advocacy has its place, and actual historical research does something different. And like establishing an honest and sound intellectual basis for advocacy is really important. I mean, again, one of the reasons that Prohibition has failed is because it was based on a bunch of nonsense that people have come to see as intellectually dishonest. And I think that people have enough awareness of cannabis and in general, hemp in particular, or medical marijuana or whatever in particular. People have enough knowledge of that now that we need to kind of be more honest and say, okay, what do we actually know about the past, right? The history of the plant. And that'll be a stronger foundation going forward, rather than kind of just continuing the political advocacy histories that are really characteristic of what's existed for people with regard to cannabis. And that's the point I make.
And what's so interesting about what you just said is that dichotomy on either side of any particular argument, they're going to grab for the most emotionally impactful exaggeration that they can come up with to make their point, their political point. And I think that that's happening right now, too. On either side of the political spectrum, you've got grandiose lies and expectations and political motivations and all of this stuff. And I think if everybody just took a step back and tried to look at the middle ground truth, you can find bits and pieces of truth on either side to validate each side. The same as for the pro and anti-cannabis movement as well. And, you started looking into this in 2011. I started writing about cannabis back in 2010. And quite honestly, I had a really tough time finding any factual information online. I had to go to hard copy books that hadn't been digitized yet in order to get to the bottom of what happened back in the 30s and to find out what the actual benefits of the plant would be. It was really tough. And so I didn't wind up launching the Cannabis Reporter until 2015, simply because I felt like I just didn't have enough information to fill a website with stories about cannabis, because almost everything I saw was sensational on either side, sensational pro and sensational against.
And that's exactly the problem. Like, people who want to know, like, the easy sources of information are, I mean, they're appealing, they're alluring, but from what I've found is that most historical representations of cannabis that are easy to get to are pretty bad. And, if you're looking at it from a different angle, trying to find out, the health impacts or the, potential medical applications, anything like that, it's the same set of obstacles. And it's not because people are out to trick everyone, but like, that's what prohibition did to knowledge, right? Not talking about access to cannabis, just knowledge, right? Our knowledge is, 80 years or whatever behind because of how, the kind of political, context of prohibition, suppressed research, right? Suppressed people finding out information. And we had people who presented information and who published books. Some of them are strong, a lot of them are bad, and it's really difficult to kind of weed through that. And, for me, again, I felt like I had to go and write a different book in order to write the book just focused on a continent. And if I was going to focus on a very particular location, then there'd be a whole other series of obstacles to get over as well. So, that's, the problem that you described is the problem that exists for so many people, that we're at the point we need to move into like new knowledge and understand that a lot of what we're doing with cannabis has no real precedence, right? Using CBD, medicinally as an extract or a tincture or whatnot, that really doesn't have any precedent, right? The ways that historical Europeans used it medicinally, it's not the same thing, right? And so we have to understand that there's a lot of new territory, which is exciting that we're moving into, but we also have to understand that a lot of the histories that we're presenting ourselves are not accurate, right? The fact that Africans and African Americans and Afro-Brazilians are completely absent from the medical literature, at least the historical, the history of medicine part of it, that's unacceptable, right? To go and say, oh, Queen Victoria used it, so therefore it's, should be, super valuable in medicine. That's dishonest and it's deceptive, and we really need to embrace the history of the plant for what it is and get past kind of the period of prohibition where it's the political advocates are those who are setting the knowledge base and setting the grounds for engagement and things like that. It certainly had its place. The political advocacy, it still has its place. I mean, there's still a lot of political challenges that people are facing, but we also need to kind of understand that political advocacy is not the same as medical science or social science or history, anything like that.
Yeah, well, two things. One is that the cannabis vernacular was removed entirely from the pharmacopoeia when it was made illegal. And back in the day when Anslinger was pushing it through Congress, did not have the support of the American Medical Association or the incarnation of it. So that's one thing. And then, the other thing I wanted to mention is that this is the reason why books like yours are so important, because we really do need to have that scholarly account to sort of counter the sensational propaganda on either side, the pro and anti-marijuana propaganda of the cannabis plant to push the political points of either side of this issue. So, kudos to you and congratulations on the book. And I'm really excited to see what happens when it comes out, because I have a feeling it's going to be one of those books that in and of itself will be of historical importance. And I'm convinced that this movement is one of the most important that we'll experience in our lifetime anyway, in terms of its impact on society in general.
I'm sorry, it's certainly a there's no other movement that I can think of that's operated in the same way, that